America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now your host for the Millennial Round Table, Liberty McArtor.
Welcome to Point of View. It's a great show today. We are excited to do the Millennial Round Table, and we have a lot of great topics to talk about today. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. These are going to be topics relating to stuff happening in the United States, around the world, things of concern to Christians and conservatives and Americans in general and broader, but specifically relevant to younger adults, millennials and Gen Zs, and that's why we're doing the Millennial Roundtable today. And I am joined by some wonderful panelists for this first hour. In studio, I have Peyton Luke, who is a media specialist for First Liberty Institute, also the producer and guest host of First Liberty Live. Peyton, thanks for being here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
And joining us by phone from Canada is Will Barclay, political theorist and private consultant, and a regular contributor now to the Millennial Roundtable here at Point of View. So, Will, thanks for being here today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure.
So I wanted to get started by looking at things happening in New York with how much Zohran Mamdani is dominating headlines, not only in the U.S., but around the world. You'd think that he was running for governor of New York or maybe even a primary in a presidential campaign, but it's just for the mayor of New York. However, it is a big city with consequence for the surrounding area. So let's talk about it a little bit, specifically socialism. So it's no surprise to anybody that in general, young adults typically are attracted to socialism, or at least that's common. And of course, we all know the old joke that if you weren't a socialist when you were 20, you didn't have a heart, and if you were still a socialist when you were 40, you didn't have a brain. But that little adage or joke that we have heard for a long time might actually be starting to become outdated. Because what's interesting, and this is what this article that we have posted for you at pointofview.net, it's from the Wall Street Journal, what this article describes is that now the group that is most drawn to socialism are not necessarily the most poor or the working class young adults who you might imagine, but actually some of the most educated. So educated Gen Z with college degrees. And by the way, Gen Z is the most educated generation on record who are in white collar jobs. They're the ones that are really favoring Mamdani, and then on a broader scale, more likely to favor socialism. And so it's interesting, and I'll just note, too, that currently Mamdani is leading Cuomo in the race in New York City by 19 percentage points. And again, and it's this kind of young adult, successful, contingency in New York that is favoring him. So, Will, I'll throw it to you first. This is something that I think may not just be unique to the United States, but maybe is happening in some other areas as well. But why do you think that, once again, young adults are so drawn to socialism, but kind of a new demographic of young adults is drawn to socialism right now?
Well, I think one of the things that I found really interesting is that kind of champagne socialism has existed for quite a while. It's really not a new phenomenon at all, the way maybe the article treats it. I think socialism and communism forever has really been something that's never really organically arisen from the working class, and is really merely a horrific structure that's being imposed upon it. And I think it's really easy to prescribe things for other people that don't really affect you, or you don't really partake in yourself. And it's always much more politically popular to tell people that the hard time that they're marred and isn't really their fault, or that they don't really need to modify or change their own comportment or behavior or actions. I think it really kind of ties into the whole modern advent of identity politics, where our fate or our lot in life isn't really the result of our own actions, but really our location upon the intersectional spectrum of identity. For Mamdani supporters, I think it's easy to say I'm unhappy and my life is bleak, not because of my actions, but because of the inevitability of my identity and the oppression it's forced to endure as a result of its relationship with, let's say, like other identities in society. To essentially say my actions are utterly inconsequential in the face of my identity. In fact, I'm barely their author, if at all. And I mean, it's simply not true. I think maybe the other thing that points to is kind of this perennial gulf between theory and practice. And it's why I think a lot of sophistry sounds good or appealing before you have any real life experiences. You get out there, so to speak, into the desert, you realize that everything is infinitely gray and not really so sterilely divided into black and white that maybe poli-sci 101 would have you believe.
Yes. So many good insights, Will, as usual. And again, you're right that a lot of times these kind of extreme ideological theories are, the people who have the privilege to think about these kinds of things aren't the ones that are really experiencing what real life looks like. And so they're kind of imposing these. But Peyton, one of the things that is interesting to note now, and I think specifically here for a lot of, maybe our peers or colleagues, is that typically, historically, at least within the U.S., it was a little bit more likely that somebody might outgrow socialism, so to speak, when they did enter the real world, like Will was saying, and they were able to, earn money and buy a house and have a career and really have a stake in the economy. But a lot of young adults are actually having a hard time doing those things. This is an interesting thing I'll mention just real quick that I didn't realize this, but the majority or the average debt held by a member of Gen Z is $90,000. And this is school loans. This is even, people who are working, who have college degrees, but they're having to buy basic things like their groceries every week on payment plans. And so because there are issues in our economy, are they going to outgrow socialism? And so that's kind of interesting to me, too. What are your thoughts?
Well, considering this is the Millennial Round Table, I think you just made an excellent point, which is very important for us to discuss with the conversation because, as you were saying, yes, if you're not a socialist in your 20s, you don't have a heart. But if you're still a socialist in your 40s, it's like, do you not have a brain? But as you said, like we're seeing people consistently still think that socialism is a good idea. And that comes with the economy and people having debt. And it sounds good in theory. Socialism can sound good in theory. And when you have these charismatic leaders like Mamdani that are presenting it.
I'm going to make it affordable for you.
Yeah.
I think the tagline is in New York, you can afford.
Exactly. And no, it's so expensive. I lived in New York for a while. I understand how that works. But anyway, it's so interesting. So again, it sounds good in theory because, socialism, it's an economic and political system where the people collectively own and control the means of production rather than, just the private individuals or the corporations. So in theory, it sounds good versus just like the rich and powerful being able to control. And they're thinking it more, it's more equality. It's more the social people, the people and the society help control and own it themselves collectively. And it sounds good in theory versus passing off some of the power to the politicians or the individuals and all. But it's just not. And we've seen that in history. And there is that saying, if you don't study history, it's doomed to repeat itself. Because here's a case in point. And I think this is part of it moving forward with the generations. I had lunch the other day with a rising college sophomore. She said in high school, she went to a private Christian high school. They hardly studied World War I, II, and they barely talked about the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis and some of those other things. Those are the stories and the history you have to study to understand and talk about the Soviet Union, because that's where you see, okay, this sounds like a good idea in general, but it's just not.
Yeah, the importance of education. We have so much more to discuss after this short break. We'll be back right here at Point of View.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Many companies have made the decision to move their headquarters out of California, but the latest decision by In-N-Out Burger is something new because their restaurants are in the state of California. And the president of In-N-Out says she is leaving not just for financial reasons, but also for personal and family reasons. Allie Beth Stuckey, who used to be one of the regular co-hosts of the Point of View Millennial Round Table, recently interviewed Lindsay Schneider, president of In-N-Out. She explained, I really loved living in Northern California, and I'm so thankful that I grew up there because I think it changed a lot of who I am today. She added, "There's a lot of great things about California, but raising a family is not easy here. Doing business is not easy here." I appreciated that she mentioned both issues. In previous commentaries, I've talked about the economic challenges in California that resulted in the exodus of companies like Tesla. The high taxes and excessive regulation are often enough for a company to leave California, but there were also the political and cultural issues that weighed heavy on her. And this was not an easy decision, given that 2/3 of all the In-N-Out restaurants are in California. You know, when I was growing up in California, we often heard people refer to the state as the Golden State. The nickname came from the California Gold Rush, but applied to the many other positive aspects. A popular song in the 1960s was California Dreaming, sung by the Mamas and Papas. It talked about people in other parts of America who had to endure cold winters and thus long for the warmth and sunshine of California. Unfortunately, people are no longer talking about California dreaming. Instead, they're talking about California leaving. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Inflation, go to viewpoints.info/inflation. That's viewpoints.info/inflation. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to Point of View. And as we were just discussing, education really does have so much to do with the ideologies that young people adopt. And we want to acknowledge, especially, right now in the United States, there are a lot of economic problems. And young people are finding that the path that their parents and grandparents followed and told them to follow of getting a college degree and then, get a job and you can pay it off and you can buy a house and start a family. It's not necessarily working out like that. However, to Will's point earlier, you're only going to, I think, damage people's outcomes and potential outcomes further if you tell them that they are not responsible, at least somewhat responsible, for their own outcomes in life. And you're taking that agency away with the identity politics. And he made such a good point. And Peyton, you were making a point that you really have to educate people about world history and be like, hey, this isn't some new idea that you just learned about in your college class. This is something that has been around. It's been tried, and people will say, oh, it hasn't been tried well, but okay, it's been tried pretty much any way you can try it. And they aren't getting that education or that insight, though, at a young age to understand how it fails every single time.
Exactly. And I can understand why some of the current, individuals, young adults are very frustrated. I mean, I'm in that demographic. Times aren't necessarily easy, but socialism, communism, those aren't going to be the answers. And before the break, I mentioned how there was a college sophomore and she is learning about more details about World War I, World War II, the Cold War for the first time now that she's in college at a private Christian school, because I'll clarify from before the break, I was talking about AP history when she was at her private Christian school. So within her AP curriculum, they weren't studying or spending much time on World War I or II. She's like, yeah, we maybe spent a day talking about a few details. But then I think that's why you're seeing this rise in college students with some of the protests and the other things, because they think this is going to be good, but they also don't understand history, and this has been tried before.
Yeah. Very good point. Well, if socialism is, in many people's mind, maybe the young up-and-coming New Yorkers' mind as the solution to all the problems, then populism is definitely the boogeyman. And so I wanted to highlight an article, Will, that you had published recently in Real Clear Politics, the International Witch Hunt for Populists. And for those of you listening, you could find this at pointofview.net. But you talk about how really, in the West, or in, nations that are allied with the United States, there is such a, like you phrased it, witch hunt for right-wing politics in general, period. And so can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing and what you were reporting on here in this article?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that what really stuck out to me is that the open persecution of the Christian musician Sean Foyt has been forced to endure when he came to Canada. It's really not extraordinary or abnormal at all. I think since about 2016, populist ideology, all right-wing ideology, in fact, has become very much openly oppressed and persecuted throughout the international political system. And virtually every nation that's been dominated by left-wing regimes or politics over the course of that past decade has vividly oppressed populist ideology and right-wing values within its society. I mean, in Germany, it's almost impossible to even purchase books by world-renowned conservative authors such as Douglas Murray due to the fact that they'd been branded as right-wing ideologues and blacklisted in Berlin. In France, Marine Le Pen, president of the National Rally Group, was recently convicted and justly punished, not for her supposed embezzlement, but specifically because she's an unabashed populist and a constant advocate for the needs of the French people. The judge who presided over her case even explicitly stated that her extreme sentence is a direct result of her serious and lasting attack on the rules of democratic life in Europe. And her populist politics. I mean, it's getting crazy. I think the other thing here is that in Canada, it's very much gotten to be, I'd say, probably worse than in France and Germany altogether. I mean, for almost 10 years, populist political actors have been consistently persecuted for their beliefs and precluded from numerous fundamental human rights, such as the right to freedom of expression, the right to religious liberty. And throughout the liberal era, Canadian society has become violently polarized, and right-wing extremism has become increasingly prevalent due to the fact that any Canadians who publicly espouse conservative values or ideologies, such as populism, have long been denied earnest access to the overwhelming majority of any legitimate avenues for political expression. And as a result, vast swaths of Canadian society have been forced to seek out political expression outside of mainstream society and its channels. And I think that very much what we've seen is that if Canada's Liberal government continues to preclude populism and conservative ideologies from accessing these legitimate channels for political expression, then it's clear that the violent political polarization and democratic backsliding that currently menace Canadian society will inevitably spill over into overt anarchy and violence as populists and conservatives everywhere throughout Canada are really forced to secure themselves against a nation that's increasingly indistinguishable, at least to them, from the state of nature.
Yes, and that was a good point that you ended on in your article that I wanted to highlight too, is that when you are ousting people, and we're not talking about, bigotry or even, hateful ideologies, which even then, okay, like we value the freedom of speech, right? And we believe, at least I believe, that the best antidote for hate speech is, okay, good speech. And you got to have a free marketplace of ideas to be able to combat the bad ideas with good ideas. But we're not even talking about that. You're just talking about people with right-wing politics, who have leaned more conservative or populist, being told that they're extreme, being completely ousted from political life. And then it's no surprise then that you continue to tell people that they're extreme and those are the only options you leave them, that they end up kind of moving that way. And then if you don't allow them to participate, in politics, as you were saying, then you lose that civility there, that social contract that we're supposed to have. But Peyton, just to rewind a little bit, what's happening is Christian musician Sean Foyt, who is American, he was going to hold several events in Canada, but they were canceled. His permits were revoked because of his politics. And so as somebody who works for First Liberty, you're familiar with Sean Foyt. On the state side, you're familiar with the battle of free expression and religious freedom. And this is something that you work with every day.
Yeah, for sure. So, Sean Foyt isn't new to these battles. Even when he's in the United States, you have a lot of people that oppose him, oppose his views, oppose Christianity. And he really rose to the forefront in 2020 during COVID because he started the Let Us Worship movement. And part of it was, calling out some of the restrictions that were put in place and calling for worship services and outdoor events. And then, of course, he ran for Congress in California. So he is not new to this scene when it comes to opposition. Now, being in Canada, I think it is important for us in this particular article. It's important for us to look at this and talk about this because it also helps us gain appreciation for some of the things that we have here in the United States, some of the protections we have here in the United States, as well as giving us foresight for what could be down the road if we don't continue to stand up and defend religious liberty as well as the right to freedom of expression, just as Will was pointing out in this article.
Yeah, very good. And Will, one thing I wanted to ask you again, and we've got just a minute or so left, but it feels like Canada, France, Europe, these nations that are so concerned about populism, it's like they're missing the forest for the trees. They're more concerned about the label than the actual ideology. And as we'll talk about, I think, after the break, there is actual hateful ideology out there, but that's okay as long as it comes from a certain wing or spectrum of kind of the politics. But they're not actually focusing on the ideas or what is being said. Just the label is what's scary and what they have to combat. Is that would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. I think that modern left-wing pundits and politicians have persistently invoked the ghoul of populism in an effort to frighten and shame people away from the right wing of the political spectrum. I think populism is really indistinguishable from democracy, and it's at best really the moniker that left-wing politicians and pundits have attached to any unwanted political outcomes and conservative results in an effort to very much ignore the real needs of the state and the bedrock of any democracy. It's people.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one thing that I want to talk about when we come back from the break, which we are about to go to, is another article by Will. He has some great stuff published this month, and this is from the Times of Israel. So let's talk about where we are actually seeing a lot of hate speech, some blatant anti-Semitism, and that is around the world, including in the United States too. People who are sympathetic to Hamas or ignoring the atrocities that Hamas is committing, not only against Israel, but against its own people. And so Will has great perspective on this, a lot of good information that we need to listen to and be aware of. But before we go to the break, don't forget, you can read all these articles for yourself and follow along with the conversation at pointofview.net. You can also share the broadcast. You can share it live right now. We're broad streaming live on social media, on X and Facebook, and we'll also be in podcast format after the live broadcast if you want to share that with a friend. But we'll be right back after this break.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kirby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Liberty McArtor.
Welcome back to the Millennial Round Table. We've already been having such great discussions, and there is so much more to talk about. So recently, Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that Israel will attempt to assume control of Gaza. So we've had states, nations around the world say that they are going to recognize Palestine as a state. Obviously, we've discussed multiple times over and over for years on the Point of View show just the inconsistency in the mainstream media in its coverage of the situation over there. And so, Will, your article in the Times of Israel argues that this suggestion or this declaration from Netanyahu of taking control of Gaza is actually, you say, the only path forward toward freedom and hope in Gaza, because something that the media probably won't highlight, the mainstream media anyway, and that a lot of people are unaware of or ignorant of, is the fact that the people who live in Gaza have been oppressed for a long time. But it's not because of Israel, it's because of Hamas. So, Will, talk us through your argument.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So for over a decade, Hamas has savagely oppressed the people of Gaza and very much brutally deprived every Gazan of their most basic needs. I think the UN itself has actually even recently forced to confirm that nearly 90% of all of the UN aid that enters Gaza is forcibly intercepted by Hamas and its armed actors well before it reaches any of its intended recipients in Gaza. I mean, since the advent of its regime in 2007, Hamas has eagerly precluded various vulnerable populations and minorities in Palestine from their fundamental human rights and freedoms. Women in Gaza have been explicitly divorced from human rights like freedom of expression and even just the ability to move freely throughout the state. I think femicides have increased by 100% between 2015 and 2020. I mean, for over a decade, Hamas's leaders have violently persecuted any free speech in Gaza at all and openly murdered any person who's dared to question or at all contradict their ideology and tyrannical decrees. And in fact, Hamas's operatives recently kidnapped one child, a youth, Odeh Nasser al-Rabai, and tortured him for hours before they brutally executed him, dumped his body at the doorstep of his family's home. One policeman said, like a puppy with a rope around his neck. I think the other thing, too, that's just important to highlight is that the Palestinian people have been so vividly oppressed and brutalized by Hamas for over a decade that they themselves now desperately desire to be rid of Hamas and liberated from its savagery very much by any means necessary. And it's not just that, but if Gaza is successfully liberated from Hamas and administered by the State of Israel, then the Jewish nation will unequivocally remain an apt and compassionate steward for the Palestinian people and earnestly guarantee their fundamental human rights, as well as the integrity of political expression in Gaza until the region is successfully stabilized and returned to some modicum of normal democratic functionality within the international political system. In a way, I feel like it's beating a dead horse, but Israel is very much the only democratic state in the Middle East, as well as the only Middle Eastern state wherein every citizen is accorded with identical human rights, regardless of their ethnicity or personal ideology. Over the past decade, the state of Israel has already permitted countless Palestinian people to flee there from Palestine in order to escape Hamas and their own respective murder. So I think in a way it's a little bit of a no-brainer. I think that Israel does need to move in there and stabilize the region if there's ever going to be any peace and hope for the Palestinian people. I think one of the sad facts of it is the state of Israel could actually vanish into the sea along with every last Jewish person. And yet, until Hamas has been thoroughly decimated and exiled from Gaza, the Palestinian people would still remain brutally oppressed and in bondage, but at the hands of their compatriots.
Yeah, and this is the perspective that you just aren't hearing very much. And so you say it's like beating a dead horse. And for people, I think, with some common sense, it is. But Peyton, the fact that Israel has been giving aid to Gaza, not just during this war, but a long time beforehand, the fact that they receive Palestinian refugees who are fleeing Hamas, the fact that Palestinians in Gaza are protesting against Hamas, these aren't things that are being talked about on college campuses where these protests are happening, aren't being highlighted in the media, certainly not on the front page. And so we have to keep talking about it because there are still so many lies.
Exactly. They are not properly represented and not truthfully representative of what is going on because Hamas's PR game is excellent for what they want you to think and believe. They are excellent manipulators. They are excellent liars. And they get people to sympathize with their causes. They know how to use their words, and they know how to use images, and they know how to use situations. Kind of like even in Will's article, he was talking about how even 90% of the UN aid that enters Gaza is forcibly intercepted by, quote, armed actors and their accompanying bands of hungry people. And so a lot of times it's like, okay, Hamas itself is the one making it to where some of its people in Palestine aren't getting these things, because guess what? They get more support. Take the pictures of the hungry children. Take the pictures of the hungry people, making it show, oh, it's Israel. Oh, it's Israel that's doing the bombings. And so they are excellent at this game. And one video that was circulating last year at the height of a lot of the protest, this was interesting, and it's going to connect to William's article as well, because it was talking about the freedoms in Israel versus a lot of the other nations surrounding. Mm-hmm. It was actually a video of a drag queen that was going around at the protest, interviewing people and asking the pro-Palestinian protesters, hey, here's a list of freedoms, whether that's women's rights, whether that's freedom if you want to live the homosexual lifestyle, all these different things. And he goes, is it Israel? Is it, Palestine? Is it this? Is it that? And most of them, no one selected, at least in the video, no one selected Israel. And then literally the drag queen goes, actually, you're wrong. It is Israel. Israel is the only place where all of these freedoms exist. If the women go over here, they're treated this way. If I was to walk into Palestine, I would be killed. I would be tortured. I would be this. Israel supports my lifestyle, and I am grateful even to be in the United States because of this. And it was actually refreshing to see someone who had a more liberal lifestyle trying to educate and make people understand the actual situation. And it was refreshing to see someone who actually got it and had appreciation, one, for the United States and two, for Israel.
Yeah. And I mean, when I've seen a lot of those videos too, so I'm glad you brought that up. And when somebody is presenting that maybe to, someone who's protesting, saying, do you realize that, maybe you couldn't even be alive if you went to Gaza right now, they are shocked.
Yep.
They don't realize that. And I think if you asked a lot of people, even people who maybe they are a little bit more educated about, the Middle East and what's going on over there, they would say, well, Hamas, of course Hamas is bad. Hamas is a terrorist organization. But I think what is also failed to be communicated so much is how intertwined Hamas is in Gaza leadership. I mean, that's who it is. They've taken over. And so even the, Gaza Health organization that will report on casualties and things like that, that is run by Hamas. And they don't differentiate between civilian and soldier deaths. And so there's so much information. And they've reported on this, how journalists who have been, documenting certain things in Gaza actually turned out to be terrorists who participated in the October 7th attacks. And then even some of the pictures that we see, that are plastered on the front page of the New York Times turn out to be without context. There was the example of very recently of a boy who looked like he was starving, and it turned out that he actually had a different condition that caused his body to look like that.
Yeah, but twist the story.
Right next to him, cropped out of the picture, was his healthy brother. And so even like so much of the information we see that we think is trustworthy just isn't. And so I think you made a great point, Peyton, that it really is a propaganda campaign. Will, about a minute left before we go to our break. Any final thoughts or points that you'd like to make regarding this particular issue in the article that you've written?
Yeah, just a couple of quick ones. I think even the boy that you're talking about received treatment for his medical condition in Israel, if I'm not mistaken.
Wow.
The other thing that I'd say, the Palestinians themselves are completely done with Hamas. They want to be rid of them. Arab Barometer, which is the longest running and most comprehensive public opinion project in the Middle East, recently confirmed that over 67% of Gazans are deeply distrustful of Hamas. And 72% of Gazans believe that Hamas and its government institutions are overwhelmingly corrupt. They're disillusioned not only with Hamas, but with the entire Palestinian leadership. I think the thing that really comes through is that although countless kind of self-styled Palestinian allies rabbis throughout North America continue to regurgitate this tattered narrative that the state of Israel must be abolished in order for the Palestinian people to be free, it's very much clear that anyone who earnestly seeks to help or liberate the Palestinian people at all must unequivocally strive to confront Hamas and expel it from the Palestinian territories, not abort the state of Israel or exterminate the Jewish people.
Yeah, absolutely. So well said. If somebody says free Palestine, maybe its response needs to be yes, from Hamas, because that's really that's what's happening. That's the truth of the situation. So again, if you're just joining us on the Millennial Round Table today and you're thinking, wow, that's a lot of interesting information, what are they talking about? Don't forget, you can go to pointofview.net and you can actually read the articles that we've been discussing today. But when we come back from the break, let's talk about MAID, medical aid in dying, and specifically how it's changing Canada. A lot to discuss there. So more when we get back from this break.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back. A few minutes in this hour, but let's talk about what's happening in Canada. I wanted to talk about this article anyway. It's from The Atlantic, and you can actually read a gift version of the article even without a subscription at pointofview.net. But I'm really glad that you could join us today on the Millennial Round Table, Will, because you are Canadian, and so I really want to get your perspective on with what's happening with MAID. So just a little background for anybody who's not familiar. This is an article that was just published in The Atlantic. It goes into a lot of detail looking at MAID 9 years later. So it was first legalized in Canada in 2016, currently accounts for 1 in 20 deaths in Canada. And what began as very narrow, so you had to have grievous and irremediable medical condition in order to qualify for medical assistance in dying. But now, 5 years later, they legalized something called Track 2, which permits adults to consent to a medical assisted death, even if their death is not immediately foreseeable. So the article explains just how kind of loose a lot of these parameters are, and how it is the providers who are having to navigate this, really deciding whether or not they will allow somebody to move forward with medical assistance in dying. And there's talk about broadening it even more. So there's so many different angles we can discuss, so many details about some of the concerning things that are happening. But Will, let's start with you. What are some of the things that you're thinking with regard to MAID and what's happening in Canada?
Yes, thank you so much. I think there's two big points that really stick out to me. I think the first thing is going into is that very much at the outset of the program with MAID, there are major concerns going into about security, discretion, screening, the audience, specifically the ability of the audience and its intended recipients to make an autonomous and informed decision. And what we discovered almost immediately is that we were correct to have those concerns. There are issues with this tool, let's call it, being used incorrectly, and we've experienced severe problems ensuring that we're preserving the autonomous and informed decision-making of the audience, right? Essentially, we've learned that we need to go back to the drawing board and reevaluate before we endeavor to push forward at all. But instead, regardless of those concerns and without addressing them at all, we've actually decided to expand the scope of this program to include mature minors even, which is really just a cute term for minors, right? These are just minors. We just labeled them something different in an effort to be vague. And people who are mentally unwell, some of the most vulnerable and at-risk populations in Canada. And so what we've done is we've not only elected to disregard all the prior concerns that were confirmed very much, as well as all the new concerns that popped up since the program has been implemented, but we've actually decided to do more of it. We've actually decided to expand the program, which makes no sense at all. And the second point I think I'd really like to point to is that this all very much seems to contradict the state's most fundamental function. The whole point of a state is to ensure security and preserve life. It seems like Canada's in a rush to in a way, kill as many people as possible. And in fact, it kind of harkens to something we've seen throughout many states in the modern era. A liberal society has really set in and dominated all contemporary media and political discourse. And what we've seen is that this notion we should have fewer kids. It's become a dirty thing in a way, and funny enough, in liberal society to have kids, and that we should make death as easily accessible as possible. This has very much become kind of like the motto nowadays. And this macabre phenomenon, it has countless implications, moral, ethical, and even economic for any country, and in particular a country that's as stagnant as Canada.
Yeah, it is macabre, and you make so many good points, especially the concerns for how it's being. I mean, I have concerns about it, period. But then the way it's being expanded to include people who are not actually, suffering from a terminal illness, and then being able to just qualify because of mental illness or just any number of reasons. Peyton, what are some of your thoughts on this?
It was scary how easy it has become. And in the article, it even talks about one of the nurses who's able to administer it, some of the situations and patients that she saw. And even she tried to give them options with a patient who was young, in his 30s, and he just didn't want to and didn't want to live. And he was able to qualify because he had certain quote unquote, mental situations, that one was actually, he had a health issue, but she said this is treatable.
Yeah, it was cancer. But
exactly.
Yeah,
this is treatable, especially with his age. And he's like, I still want to die. And she was like, if you could know that 100% you could walk away with this and live, would you do it? And he goes, no, because I don't want to experience any pain because there will be side effects from a couple of the medications or radiation. So literally he decided to end his life entirely because he was afraid of any kind of pain whatsoever.
And they gave it to him.
They gave it to him. And she walked away feeling so horrible about that. Now, I have to admit, there are times that I look at this and it's like, part of me kind of sympathizes with someone if they're on their deathbed, they're dying, they're in so much pain, or they're a vegetable. And it's like, part of me wants to, like, as a Christian, it's not right, and I have a whole nother conversation for that. But part of me, my human side, all of us have those moments with death, and we wonder, how are we going to die? Because we're all going to die someday. Is it going to be painful? Is it going to be traumatic? All these things. But at the end of the day, you have to remember, the Lord ordains your life. The Lord ordains your steps. And then in my case, then I can't support this because I'm not going to play God.
Right.
Like, I cannot do that. I will not do that. But I could see where some people are coming from with terminal illnesses. But then when you have these 30-year-olds that just don't want to experience any kind of pain and they can get it, or the minors, and they had even a story in there that makes you sympathize a little bit when it's like these 90-year-olds and they literally end their life together to complete their romance story while holding hands to their family, their children or their grandchildren surrounding them. Like, that sounds nice in theory, but that is covering and is the kind of the facade for what is really happening behind the scenes with people that are healthy, that have years and years ahead of them, and the scary thing it's doing for Canada and minors and people that are perfectly healthy and could live good, normal lives.
Yeah. Well, we only have a couple minutes left before we let you go, but it's been great to have you with us this hour. Final thoughts on this topic, particularly since there are really a lot of people, unfortunately, who are lacking resources, and they are feeling maybe pressured to choose this option, not because they necessarily want it, but because they can't afford actual medical care. Or like in some cases, there was even a quote, it's easier in some cases to get a wheelchair, or it's easier to get made than it is to get a wheelchair. So how, as a nation, how do you solve those problems? How do you reach out to those people in their need?
Well, I think first of all, in a lot of ways, it very much preys upon this natural human urge for compassion, right? I think this is something we all agree upon. I think, though, that why it's being trotted out by the left is very much because the left was, in a way, rejects all struggle. I think there's something that came up from the Mamdani piece, actually. I think that because there's no easy or painless solution in practice to this question, maybe, and all of life is very much gray and tinged by unimaginable pain and hardship, the left very much rejects it. But what they're also rejecting is what kind of lies on the other side is beautiful, right? Leftists, I think, would reject that beauty that lies on the other side of struggle and achieving something, that mountaintop and its peak, very much simply because of the struggle that it takes to get there. And I think that in a way, that's what we're seeing here with the 30-year-olds who are choosing death over life simply because life is hard.
Yeah. Wow. So well said. Will, it's been great to have you with us this hour of the Millennial Round Table. You can find Will on X, Will Barclay, BBC, and look up his writings and follow him there. And you can also find his links to see more of his articles and connect with him on social media if you go to pointofview.net. But we have another hour of Millennial Round Table. Josh Barnes is going to be joining us in the next hour, and we're going to continue this conversation for a while because there are actually 11 states in the United States where assisted suicide is legal, and we have a lot more to discuss as well. So stay with us. We'll be back after this.
Let me ask you something, if I may. Have you been blessed by Point of View? We often hear from listeners about the positive impact that Point of View has in their lives. As one listener told us, Point of View leaves me informed and encouraged. So this may surprise you. Out of all the Point of View's hundreds of thousands of listeners, just 1% supports the program. And yet Point of View relies on listener donations. If every listener gave just $10, Point of View's full ministry and operations would be funded for an entire year. Let me ask you again, have you been blessed by Point of View? I urge you, pay it forward today with a $10 donation so others may be blessed as well. Give online at pointofview.net. Or you can call us and give toll-free 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Thank you, Kirby. I really appreciate your program. You cover a lot of issues that a lot of us think about, I'm sure. And this is the first time I've ever called in, so I appreciate your input, too.
Oh, I thank God for what you're doing on Point of View. You guys have more influence across this country than I believe any of them in terms of tackling the issues and getting the truth out to Americans. It's getting to the point where truth just is bottled up on every hand. Every time you turn around, there's another big bottleneck against truth. I hope your listeners realize what Point of View is doing and supports Point of View in every possible way you can.
You know, I can't go to Washington. I can't do those things, so the only way that I can help is the way that God has provided for me, and to give some of that back to you guys. So, like you said, partnering with Point of View, because, you know, you can't do it alone. Thank you very much for what you guys do. Believe me, it's a needed thing, and I just hope everybody certainly would get on the bandwagon with you.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now your host for the Millennial Round Table, Liberty McArtor.
Welcome back to the Millennial Round Table. It's been a great show so far, and if you're just now joining us, you can go to pointofview.net and catch up on the articles that we've discussed that you've missed, or you can listen to the first hour. But right now, I still have in studio with me Peyton Luke, who is with First Liberty Institute. So Peyton, glad you're here still.
Happy to be here. Happy to hang out. Good conversations.
It is. And we have a lot more to discuss. And joining us this hour is Josh Barnes. He is a frequent voice on the Millennial Round Table. I've had him on the Know Why podcast. He's a pastor in New Hampshire and also host of the popular YouTube channel, The Bible Explained. So Josh, welcome back to the Millennial Round Table.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Josh, we're kind of bringing you into an ongoing conversation that we were having in the last hour, but it's something so important. I want to keep talking about it and definitely get your perspective. And that's what's going on in Canada. And so The Atlantic had a very in-depth, just really eye-opening piece called "Is Canada Killing Itself?" Because 9 years after MAID, medical assistance in dying, was legalized, 1 in 20 Canadians are actually dying by euthanasia. And as we were discussing before the break, you have just seen an erosion of the initial safeguards that were there. Now you do not have to be terminally ill to elect to die with MAID. They're even considering opening it up to, quote, mature minors. And you are seeing kind of just it getting abused or being brought up a lot in options as an option for people with disabilities or maybe lower income, and they're having a hard time paying for treatment. And MAID is introduced to them as an option. Have you thought about dying? And so this is so dark in so many reasons, but it relates to us not just because what happens with our allies and our neighbors around the world matters, but medical assisted suicide is legal throughout the U.S. as well, in California, Colorado, Delaware, D.C., Hawaii, Montana, Maine, New Jersey, New Mexico, Oregon, Vermont, and Washington. So 11 states plus D.C. And so this could be where we go as a nation if we're not careful. So, Josh, feel free to take it any direction, but I'd love to get your perspective on this issue as a whole.
Yeah, my goodness. I was listening to the last hour, and I heard you say that 11 states in the United States had medical assistance in dying legalized already, and I had to look it up. I just did not believe that was true, and you're absolutely right. Of course, everyone, of course, knew that. But my goodness, I cannot, this is so difficult for me to wrap my mind around. And that article is so difficult to read, but yet, oh my goodness, it's like you got to see what's going on in our country. You can't look away and do nothing. It is awful what is taking place in Canada and what is now taking place in America as well. I would say that, man, I have so many things to say, but there's two words that come to mind, and it really sort of underscores where we are as a society, because these two words don't mean anything to us, and they are duty and purpose. We have a duty to live our lives. We've been given our lives, and we have a duty to use them. We don't have the right to do whatever we want with the time that God has given us. And even there was a time in society when even if you didn't believe in God, you still felt that you were duty-bound to use your life, maybe for your parents because your parents gave you life and you have to honor them, or maybe for some other God that you might worship. But there used to be a concept in our society where duty would demand that you live your life and fulfill a purpose with it. Now, for Christians, the purpose has always been, clearly, Jesus Christ and his reason for creating us and saving us from our sins. But duty and purpose was just accepted by all societies all over the world. And now we're to this place where we are so self-centered and we live so much for ourselves. Everything is about my pleasure. Everything is about my comfort. And the minute I feel the least bit of discomfort, and these are the types of stories that are in that article for those who haven't read it, the minute I feel the least bit of uncomfort, or I'm afraid I might feel some discomfort in trying to live and survive, I'm willing to throw my life away. This is a terrible, awful, depressing commentary on the state of Western society.
Yes. Oh, you are so right, Josh. And I appreciate your biblical perspective on that. It's interesting that the two words that you highlighted were duty and purpose. And the flip side of that is what really stuck out to me, and that was autonomy. And this is a word that you read out through the article over and over again. Autonomy, choice, control. These are the values. And so even when you're, reading these interviews with these doctors who are administering these, fatal medications to kill people who have said that they want to die, when they have qualms, they say, well, it's, I don't want to interfere with their autonomy. It's their autonomous choice. That is the right. And so if that is the right, you can call it personal liberty if you want, even though we like the word liberty in the United States of America, obviously. But if it comes down to my right to do whatever I want. Then if that's your guiding value, Peyton, then there's no reason why you can really say, well, you can't do that. It's like, well, why not? It's my choice.
Exactly. And I think that goes back to what Josh was saying as far as it being a little very self-centered and them not truly realizing the duty and purpose and that their life is a gift to this world. The Lord ordained their life from the beginning. And so the fact that they lose sight of that or they never knew that is just so heartbreaking, because in this life we will have struggles, but the most amazing stories we hear about people that we look up to, it's also that, they overcame those struggles and, they worked through. It's part of the human experience to have, weaknesses and struggles and pain. That's part of this life. That's part of the fall at the beginning with Adam and Eve. And so the fact that they don't realize that their life is a gift and they focused on their self versus what can I give to others? What can I do in my life to alleviate the pain of others and bring in community and help others not feel alone, help others through these dark and difficult times? There's just so much more to unpack in this conversation. I look forward to that when we get back from the break.
Yes, we are about to go to a break. One quick thought, and then we can discuss this a little bit more before we move on. You can't really have a campaign against suicide, I don't think, in a culture, or encourage people not to commit suicide if you make this legal. And so I think that's what we're facing as a society. In fact, one of the anecdotes in the article was about a woman who went to the ER in Canada because she was having suicidal ideation, and they actually offered her MAID. So we'll talk about that a little bit more, plus several other topics when we get back from this break.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Many Many companies have made the decision to move their headquarters out of California, but the latest decision by In-N-Out Burger is something new because their restaurants are in the state of California. And the president of In-N-Out says she is leaving not just for financial reasons, but also for personal and family reasons. Allie Beth Stuckey, who used to be one of the regular co-hosts of the Point of View Millennial Round Table, recently interviewed Lindsay Schneider, president of In-N-Out. She explained, I really loved living in Northern California, and I'm so thankful that I grew up there because I think it changed a lot of who I am today. She added, there's a lot of great things about California, but raising a family is not easy here. Doing business is not easy here. I appreciated that she mentioned both issues. In previous commentaries, I've talked about the economic challenges in California that resulted in the exodus of companies like Tesla. The high taxes and excessive regulation are often enough for a company to leave California, but there were also the political and cultural issues that weighed heavy on her. And this was not an easy decision, given that 2/3 of all the In-N-Out restaurants are in California. You know, when I was growing up in California, we often heard people refer to the state as the Golden State. The nickname came from the California Gold Rush, but applied to the many other positive aspects. A popular song in the 1960s was California Dreaming, sung by the Mamas and Papas. It talked about people in other parts of America who had to endure cold winters and thus long for the warmth and sunshine of California. Unfortunately, people are no longer talking about California dreaming. Instead, they're talking about California leaving. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Inflation, go to viewpoints.info/inflation. That's viewpoints.info/inflation. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to the Millennial Round Table. We've been talking about this article that was in The Atlantic. It's on the situation with MAID, medical assistance in dying in Canada, and it's an important read, so I encourage you to go to pointofview.net and read the article for yourself, because it does preview what can happen here if we continue to allow this issue to spread throughout the United States as well. Peyton, you mentioned right before the break that there's some biblical wisdom that can shed some light on this kind of tough issue, isn't there?
Sure. And in the last hour, I was saying how, there are moments that when I hear about some of the cancer patients and people that are just in horrific pain and there's, no way that they're, going to be able to have a healthy life again, there's parts that, you want to sympathize and you do kind of, you're human. But then as Christians, we have to keep our eyes on the Lord and our purpose in life and focus on serving others. But just as some encouragement, I did pull up a couple of the Bible verses. So Ecclesiastes 3:1-2, for everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die. All of life has a beginning and it has an end, and we can rest in the fact that God has created both. And then Romans 14:8, for if we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So then, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. Life and death is in his hands, and he makes our steps. So, and then 2 Corinthians 4:16-18, so we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light, momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal.
Yeah. Thank you, Peyton, for reading God's word and encouraging us with that. And that is the truth that we need to declare. And, there's so much here that we could discuss. This is such an important issue with so many implications for how we view life. But we do have some other things to discuss. But before we do that, Josh, any other thoughts or final things that you'd like to say on this particular issue before we move on?
Yeah, well, definitely, I would like to say that this is the natural result of atheism. This is atheism run, its course being fully run here. When the article even admits it. It quotes Jonathan Regler, who's one of the family physicians who does these murders. They're killing people. And his quote was, once you accept that people ought to have autonomy, once you accept that life is not sacred and something that can only be taken by God, a being I don't believe in, then if you're in that work, some of us have to go forward and say, we'll do it. So he says he's experiences discomfort about doing this, but he just keeps reminding himself that there is no God and that life is not sacred, and someone's entire life revolves around themselves, wasn't created for a purpose, life doesn't matter. This is the result of atheism. It's why Christianity is not only important just for a person individually, it's important for a society, it's important for our country to espouse Christian principles. It is, it's a great case in point, a very sad but excellent case in point as to why Christianity is so fundamental.
Yes, our foundational human rights come from the Lord, and come from a Christian worldview, and so we have to acknowledge that. Just a couple final things mentioned in the article. Canada is currently talking about legalizing MAID for mature minors, which would require parental consultation but not parental consent.
Wow.
They are also considering the possibility of legalizing euthanasia for infants born with severe malformations, which is currently already practiced legally in the Netherlands. The last country that adopted that was Nazi Germany in 1939. And
Wow.
so we are really not that far removed in the modern West, this supposedly enlightened civilizations, from committing these atrocities. In fact, they're already happening. So something to be aware of. But again, if you want to learn more about that, then read the article. It's posted at pointofview.net. But I did want to turn to another issue. So this is an article from the Free Press. It is on therapy. And so kind of still talking about maybe a mental health issue and kind of those same themes of duty and purpose from a different perspective, particularly when it comes to kids, because we know that there is a mental health crisis among youth in the United States, and people are rightly concerned about that, and they're looking for answers to that. But as this article from Abigail Schreier in the Free Press notes, a lot of the methods that people are using to go about treating it or screening for it can actually cause more harm. And so I wanted to bring this up because, as young adults, millennials, maybe Gen Z listeners, obviously we've had increased mental health issues among our generations. A lot of us maybe have kids that are going back to school, and maybe when they go to school, they're going to face a mental health screening saying, have you ever considered killing yourself? And they're in 5th grade. And maybe that's not the healthiest question to ask when you're screening for mental health problems. So, Josh, what are your thoughts, as a pastor, as an American, as a dad, on some of the arguments in this article from the Free Press?
Yeah, whoever chose these articles, Liberty, was just excellent. It was spot on. These are very thought-provoking, interesting articles. Really sad, but the article correctly points out that mental health is in your mind. There are very few mental health conditions that have physical that are physically related. In other words, you have some sort of depletion of the right chemicals in your brain, and you need actual medication for this. Most mental health conditions are things that are in your mind. So what happens when you ask somebody over and over, are you sure you're not depressed? Are you sure you're not this? Are you sure this could explain all of this? What you're doing is you're giving them a mental health condition that's obvious. You don't treat mental health conditions by asking people all the time if they have them. And the article points this out, I think, very, very well. And the questions, ask a kid repeatedly if he might be depressed, is a quote here. How about now? Are you sure? He might just decide that he is. Mm-hmm. I think that's an excellent statement that really summarizes the whole article very well.
Yeah, so this is Abigail Schreier. She's the author of Bad Therapy, a book that came out last year. And I will just put a disclaimer here. I think that biblically based therapy and psychologically informed therapy and counseling can be very great tools. But her book is about bad therapy. And there is a lot of that is happening. And a lot of the things that maybe work or are effective for adults, when you try to push that on kids when they're still so impressionable, then that can lead to very bad results, as Josh was highlighting with some of the things in the article. So this has been instituted in Illinois, where the state law will actually mandate annual mental health screenings for all public school children. So some of these kids are actually getting introduced to some of these things on the screenings, like learning that maybe they should be anxious about a test they're about to take when maybe that wouldn't have entered their mind. So many examples. And so we need to treat the mental health crisis among youth seriously, but this may just make it worse. Peyton, what were some of your thoughts?
Yeah, for sure. Well, good on her for asking for these questions, because for those who haven't read the article yet, essentially what happened when she took her daughter or her child to the doctor, they asked the mom to step out so that way they could ask these screening questions. And the mom was like, well, but what are you going to ask my child? And they handed her, the list, and she took a picture of it. And that's how she knew. And then that kind of made the light bulb go off of, oh my goodness, because as a child, some of these things, unless you're told, you're not naturally going to be thinking about them. And then especially when adults are consistently asking you or telling you certain things like, hey, you might be depressed, or hey, you have anxiety, or hey, so much is going on, or have you thought about killing yourself? Most kids wouldn't have, but then when they hear it consistently as a child, you tend to really believe what the adults tell you.
Yeah.
And then you consistently hear it. And so that starts to get in your head. And if they're bringing this up, I must be this way. Or if I'm acting quote unquote bad, they think I'm also then
Something's
bad
wrong
and
with me.
anxious and depressed, and something's wrong with me. So now I need these meds. And there's more and more studies going into it when it comes to nutrition and exercise as well. But no, this is just a fascinating topic.
Yeah, so let's discuss this and more when we get back from this break.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer. And that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Liberty McArtor.
Welcome back to the Millennial Round Table. We've been discussing an article from the Free Press by Abigail Schreier. She's the author of Bad Therapy, on how a lot of public school districts are implementing mental health screenings for kids. And again, there is a mental health crisis among youth in the United States. But as she argues, based on a lot of research that she's done into this topic, these kinds of screenings and this approach may actually make the problem worse for kids. So wanted to highlight you can check into your school if you have kids in public school and ask them if they implement any sort of screening like this or how they address mental health issues, because you probably have access to a law that allows you to opt out of those things. But a lot of times that isn't communicated to parents, which is one of the things that she points out in the article. But Peyton, did you have any other thoughts on this issue as a whole?
Sure. And I will also say, on piggyback off of you on the opt-out situation, some teachers may not even know the opt-out exists. So at first you might get a little bit of pushback until they look a little farther in, because we've had cases at First Liberty in different situations when it comes to opt-outs. And at first the school either pushes back or the teacher doesn't even realize that is an option. And then they look at it and they're like, yeah, no, you need to let the opt-out move forward. Anyway, so I encourage parents to look into that and know their rights. But anyway, I did want to mention that even though we're talking about this, sometimes there are, of course, legitimate imbalances mental health issues as well. And if your child is struggling, I encourage you to get help from a very, trusted doctor and all, because we don't want to act like we're pushing all mental health aside and that's not a real thing.
Right.
That's not what we're saying here. We're just saying that it's become very popularized, if you will. And in a way, for kids, especially when we're talking adolescents, they are very influenced by social settings. So sometimes depression and mental health and anxiety recently has almost become like a social standard, or almost like, oh, you're
a label.
A label, or sometimes something for attention, or, oh, you're fitting in. Oh, you have anxiety and depression. I also have anxiety and depression. And then they just get into that versus, encouraging each other and us normalizing, hey, let's either get you help, or, hey, that's not the standard. You shouldn't consistently live in that cycle. But anyway, It has become very prolific, and so it's important that we don't mislabel. And I think that's the heart of what this article is trying to get to, that we don't jump to conclusions and assumptions too quickly, because at some point, it's just tough being an adolescent, guys. Right. It's tough being a teenager. It's tough being a kid sometimes, but you have to learn and grow through that. And that's where you need mentors, you need positive activity. So it's like, okay, there has been a lot of screen time. And for some parents, they're doing a lot of screen time themselves and not giving their kids the adequate attention or taking them on outdoor trips. So it's important, get outside time, do sports, do music, church, teach your kids to serve others, so they're not just in their own head so much. And I know this would be a whole nother topic, but even with kids and acting out, they've done even more studies when it comes to Red 40 and what's in, all the different foods. And so often they jump to, oh, let's just medicate their kids and all these things. And it's like, there are steps you can take toward healthy, positive things. And if those things aren't working after a consistent amount of time, then maybe take some of these next steps, but try to do the most naturally.
Yeah, absolutely. Great thoughts. What about you, Josh? Any other feedback on this article or this topic?
Yeah, Peyton, you're spot on there, and you said some of the things that I had wanted to say, so I appreciate you taking that forward. But there's another thing. I wanted to read to, if it's all right,
sure,
the 5 questions that are listed in that article. And I think the audience will hear, when they hear these questions, they'll say, what? They're asking this to kids? So in the past few weeks, have you wished you were dead? In the past few weeks, have you felt that you or your family would be better off if you were dead? In the past week, have you been having thoughts about killing yourself? Have you ever tried to kill yourself? If yes, how and when? And are you thinking of killing yourself right now? If yes, please describe.
So much repetition.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, and I think everybody instinctively knows what that does to it. Now, as Peyton said, I've done a little bit, I'm not an expert on this at all. I've done a little bit of research on this, and I have some friends who have dealt with this. There is such a thing as a chemical imbalance or clinical depression that needs actual medicine and real help. But the majority of what is being called, some sort of mental condition today really just needs somebody, maybe it's a therapist or a pastor, or somebody to talk to you to help you think rightly about issues and not be so depressed, right? What you don't do to fix depression is have people think all the time about killing themselves and about their depression. You think about positive things, or in the case of a Christian, you have a really great opportunity to think about how God's in charge, he's in control, he has a purpose and behind all things, sort of like David when he was greatly distressed in 1 Samuel, and he encouraged himself in the Lord. He just went straight to his purpose in God and said, well, hang on, if God has a purpose for me, then there's something left for my life, even though I've lost so much, I'm going to keep on going. That's what people need, and that's the opposite of what people are getting. In fact, I think they're being given mental conditions by these questions.
Yeah. And, again, for people who maybe haven't read the article, those were questions that were asked to, or going to be asked to, a middle school aged boy who came to the doctor for a stomach ache. And they asked his mom, who's the author of this article, to leave the room so they could ask these questions in private. And she said, hold on, what questions are you going to ask? And then she took a picture of the questionnaire.
And that's crazy because he went there for a stomach ache. That wasn't even the issue.
Yeah.
Like, oh my goodness.
And it's, again, like, asking a 12-year-old, are you thinking of killing yourself right now? Please describe. Don't put that in their head. And don't ignore if there, are signs of an issue. But, I think a lot of this comes down to, we want to create awareness. And kids, especially if they're in school, they are going to run into other people who are talking about this. Mm-hmm. If they're online at all, they're going to see it online, unfortunately, which is why many people are doing the tech exit, which is
or the chatbots that sometimes give you step-by-steps on how to.
That's happened.
That's scary.
That has happened. Yep. Yes, minors have been encouraged to, unfortunately, commit suicide with chatbots. So they might encounter it in the world. And so I think for Christian parents, you want to strike a balance of, you want to create an open environment where your kids can talk to you and say, hey, whatever question, whatever issue, I'm not going to be embarrassed. You're not going to get in trouble for asking. You can talk to mom and dad about anything. And you establish that foundation of trust because you want to have an open, ongoing conversation about the real issues that they encounter. But that is, and then you want to speak truth to them. And that's different than kind of being separated from family, cut off from, actual positive mentors, like Josh was saying, or a licensed counselor in a controlled setting, and then just being on your own as a kid in a classroom with a bunch of other kids, and then being presented with these questions, or being separated from your parents in a doctor's office, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, my tummy hurts, and now I'm being asked all this, like this,
Should I be thinking these things?
Right. Yeah. That's the difference there. Mm-hmm. So it's food for thought for parents and grandparents, and just to say, hey, how are they addressing this issue in my school? And how do I want to control the conversation around mental health and getting resources for my kid. And so maybe, you're the one that initiates that, but you do so in a positive way and you give them that firm foundation. But you can find that article and read it for yourself at pointofview.net. We're about to go to a break in a couple minutes, but let me just introduce the next topic of conversation. And oh my goodness, this show is flying by. There's been so much good conversation and so much more that I want to get to. But speaking of technology, if you have an Alexa or thing like that in your home, you may think I'm crazy. I don't think you should, but this is an article from the Wall Street Journal, Why Amazon Wants an AI Bracelet That Records Everything You Say. I thought this was worth discussing, and Peyton, you and I have kind of talked about it a little bit off air, just because these are the devices that are becoming more and more ubiquitous, and people may not be aware of what they are and what they do. But the article opens like this. It's funny, after a decade of Amazon saying Alexa isn't listening to your every word, the company is buying a bracelet that can. And so it's called Bee. It's the company that Amazon is acquiring. It's a wearable bracelet that listens all day long. You don't turn it on. It just is always listening. It transcribes all your conversations, including when you talk to yourself. Now, you don't have to admit that you talk to yourself, but if you're listening, you know who you are. And then it uses AI to turn that giant word soup into a searchable history. So then it can anticipate your needs. It can offer up to-do lists based on what it's heard, or send you articles or events based on your conversations with yourself, your family, or your friends. There are a lot of concerns and privacy implications, I think, and we're going to talk a bit about that when we come back from this break.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back. A few minutes left today for the Millennial Round Table, and it's been such a good conversation. So go back at look at pointofview.net and catch up with the conversation if you've missed any part today. But let's talk a little bit more about this bracelet that Amazon is acquiring. And Josh, there are obviously so many privacy concerns that I have with this particular product, a bracelet that is always transcribing everything. And you think, okay, you don't think that can be hacked or spied on by somebody else. But I think also just we're seeing more products like this too, even so-called smart glasses or AI glasses that are talking to you throughout the day, that are constantly recording and allowing people to save clips of things they see throughout their day. So there's kind of this trend of just like always needing to be on and have something that's recording your life. And so what's your take on that?
I'm trying to think of why anyone would ever use this thing. This seems terrifying.
Yes.
Who would do this to themselves? And I wonder if we millennials are getting old now and the Gen Z would be rolling their eyes at us because they like all the new technologies. But, this just seems crazy to me. Who in their right mind would hire a stenographer to follow them around and transcribe everything they say all day long and then give them suggestions about what they should do based on what they just said? Who wants that? Nobody wants that. I mean, so this just seems absolutely ridiculous. And that's at its best. At its worst, you point out, and of course, we all know these companies would never sell our data
No, of course not.
It was perfectly safe. It couldn't possibly be hacked or leaked or anything like that. So, this seems absolutely insane. And the people who buy this, I just have to say, I don't understand you at all. I do not understand why you would buy it. And I think that, not to be rude, but I think you got what's coming to you if this turns out to be what I think it is, which is a giant way to track and keep tabs on people.
Yeah, we already know, and China, they've got the social credit score, and they're constantly being watched. And so, if you say something wrong or you do something, it can be like, "Oh, sorry, you can't get on the bus today." Like,
right.
That's already happening in places around the world. I really don't think maybe people aren't thinking, and this is not a political issue. I don't care who's in charge. I don't want them to have that kind of control over my life. But anyway, Peyton, what are your thoughts?
Well, maybe we also, some of these people, I feel like they think they're cooler than they are, or they're just so self-absorbed that they think what they're saying all day is worthwhile. Like, part of that's just life. Like, okay, yeah, you might be doing an autobiography, but even the best autobiographies of like past presidents and people that have done amazing, amazing things, like, you don't write down every single thing you say and do for the day. I'm sorry, no one's going to buy your autobiography. Like, let me just cut to the chase, be real with you, take cliff notes or turn on your computer dictation when you have something worth saying.
Yeah, and there are tools when you need something like that, but this is not.
Exactly.
This is not
think before you speak. But this also gives me concern when it comes to privacy for others.
Yes.
Because it's not just them, it's everyone around them. And so part of me wonders if people also want it so you can catch other people in, quote, offending you or saying things against you, because so much of that is brought up nowadays. Oh, you misgendered me. Oh, you used the wrong pronoun. Oh, you said this other offensive thing. Now I'm going to get you in trouble because of that. So I wonder if that's a little bit of a thing. But the glasses part, the glasses that are always recording, that really concerns me for people's privacy. Just think of bathrooms and other things that, goodness, that's not okay.
Yeah, and so on that, and that's not specifically mentioned in the article, but I did bring it up because it's one of the related devices, I think, that they are advertising.
There's already advertisements out for it, so it's coming.
Yes, there's Meta has AI glasses. There's a new brand called Waves. I believe there's an Android version. So, and this is where it does get a little scary, because if you're not recognizing it, then you may not be aware when people are wearing these. And can result in being recorded against your will. And so, there is such an urge and a drive right now. And this is something that the Trump administration has been pushing, obviously, trying to, woo all these tech giants. And you're seeing more and more of these data centers go up around the nation. And it's kind of presented as an arms race. It's like an AI arms race with China. We have to be on the forefront of AI. And so we're going to hear all these products and hear all these innovations. And it's like, to quote Jurassic Park, you thought so much about whether or not you could, you didn't stop to think about whether you should.
Yeah, the restrictions and the laws.
And I'm sure there are national security implications and, weapons implications, which is why they want to do this. But we're talking about people's, privacy here. And just kind of our human rights to be able to go around our life. And, there's a balance between, law enforcement and, getting information and things like that, but then having your right to privacy. But Josh, any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking as Peyton was talking that this will certainly intensify marriage disputes when you have a transcription of everything that was said. Yeah. I didn't say that. Yes, you did.
I've got it right here.
On October 23rd, you said this, 8:01 p.m.
Yep.
That's exactly what I was. But, in all seriousness, just to wrap it up and talk about the Bible for a second, there is someone who is watching and is recording everything you're saying and everything you're doing. And there is a judgment one day, and it's not standing before Amazon. It is standing before God. And I think that's my last word.
Wow. Yeah. And that's a good reminder too. And, the Bible says to be above reproach. And I was taught that the definition of integrity is doing the right thing, even when no one's watching. And we should do that because, like you said, Josh, we're going to stand before the Lord. We are standing before the Lord. There's nothing that we are doing that is not seen by him. So, however, I think the reality that we're entering where we may have to accept a world where people have bracelets and glasses and things that aren't super obvious, but where we may actually be recorded all the time. Check your life. Are you walking in integrity? Are you ready to, have everything that you've said put on blast potentially? Live without reproach, as the Bible says. Peyton, any final thoughts before we round out our show today?
Goodness. Oh, goodness. I was also just thinking of minors, too, when it comes to the glasses and the recordings, because so often you have to give a disclaimer and sign a release for your child's, image to go places. But the fact that people could just be out in public recording and then just use it for whatever reasons, that's really, really concerning. But I agree we should be above reproach in all things. But, hey, these are things that are, coming. They're going to be here before we know it. And we have to learn how we're going to live with them. And maybe people are just going to become hermits more and stay in the privacy of their own home.
We'll see. It's definitely, it's interesting how it's going to impact society. And we could keep talking about it forever, but the show is at an end. So Josh, we got a few seconds left, but tell us where we can find more of your work and the things that you're producing right now.
Yeah, just check out The Bible Explained on YouTube. That's youtube.com/@thebibleexplained. And got a bunch of videos up there, lots of things I'm explaining about the Bible.
Awesome. And then Peyton, if people want to learn more about protecting their fundamental rights and religious freedom, where should they go?
Yeah, firstliberty.org.
Awesome. Well, it has been wonderful having you with us on today's edition of the Millennial Round Table. Again, go to pointofview.net if you missed any part of the conversation. You can read the articles for yourselves. You can share the conversation and re-listen to it. Tomorrow, Kirby Anderson will be back with the weekend edition, and there will be a lot to discuss tomorrow as well. So make sure that you tune in. But for now, have a good rest of your Thursday.
Let me ask you something, if I may. Have you been blessed by Point of View? We often hear from listeners about the positive impact that Point of View has in their lives. As one listener told us, Point of View leaves me informed and encouraged. So this may surprise you. Out of all the Point of View's hundreds of thousands of listeners, just 1% supports the program. And yet Point of View relies on listener donations. If every listener gave just $10, Point of View's full ministry and operations would be funded for an entire year. Let me ask you again. Have you been blessed by Point of View? I urge you, pay it forward today with a $10 donation so others may be blessed as well. Give online at pointofview.net. Or you can call us and give toll-free 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.